Okay, welcome everybody to another episode of Lived Experience for Everyone. And we are super excited, humbled, and honored to have Professor Jack Caputo with us. And I'm your host, Joseph Rivera, with co-host Helena Connolly. And over the next 45 minutes to an hour, we'll be talking with Jack Caputo about his legacy and his work. For those listeners who are not in the field or not in academia, Jack Caputo is something of a legend, and certainly for myself and for Helena, a celebrity, if you might say something like that, in the field. And so we're extremely excited to talk to him about his work. He has been publishing for more than 50 years in the field of theology, philosophy of religion, philosophical theology. He's written academic works and more popular or non-academic works as well. And we're hoping to get into some of that with Jack Caputo today. And he taught for many decades at Villanova University and Syracuse University, and has supervised and produced several accomplished students in their own right who are now professors. And so the contribution just to the field is really unparalleled, and we're delighted to have him on today. And so I thought we might start off asking Jack about a recent, or excuse me, a book to be released soon in the spring on the topic of theopoetics. So Jack, why don't you tell us a little bit about your most recent book coming out?
Well, thank you very much, Helena. It's a pleasure to be here. The book is coming out in the spring from Columbia University Press in the spring, and my editors are joking that they're aiming to bring it out on Good Friday, which I'm actually an after the death of God philosopher, not a death of God. And the book was originally just called Theopoetics, and then the subtitle was Theology, Phenomenology, and the Future of Religion. But they decided that wasn't sexy enough, so we went back and forth for a while about the title, and so finally the title that we all agreed on was A Radical God, and then in the subtitle would be Theopoetics, Phenomenology, and the Future of Religion. So a radical God. So if there's a theopoetic attitude on our part, then the correlate to that would be the notion of God. And if theopoetics is radical theology, then the corresponding notion of God would be a radical God. So, okay. These people know about marketing, right? And we're philosophers, we don't know about that stuff. So I listen to them when they have ideas about marketing. But this was a bigger change than I'm used to. So I had to sort of go back and tweak the manuscript a little bit to make it look like I knew that was the title, because when I wrote the book, that wasn't the title. But when I started working with it, I was pretty happy with it, and it's an attempt to. I've discovered over the course of the years that I have used the expression poetics a lot, because what I mean by radical is a displacing of conceptual, propositional, hard logical thinking with an alternate mode of thinking, which in terms of the standard categories of philosophy would be phenomenology, right? I think phenomenology is a descriptive, experiential, more, let's say, tender or subtle way of thinking about things, as opposed to the hard concepts of classical philosophy and metaphysics, or what we nowadays call ontotheology. And I often, in the course of trying to establish that discourse, that sort of way of speaking and philosophizing, would call it a poetics. And then when I came in contact with Catherine Keller, I guess, probably more than anybody, I heard her talking about theopoetics. I said, well, it's kind of, I like that. That's a good fit for what I'm doing. And so I started using the word theopoetics, I don't know, somewhere around 10, 15 years ago, somewhere. I could track it down if I wanted to. But I never actually spelled out in any systemic way what I meant by it. And then in 2023, I got invited to. I'm of such an age now that I was invited by the Duquesne Simon Silverman Center, which is a world sort of a center for phenomenology, the study of phenomenology, and they keep archives. And so they wanted, and they have the archives of some, mostly dead white German guys. But now they're sort of updating it with some Americans. And so they invited me to basically leave them my correspondence and notes and library and stuff. And then we had a conference sort of celebrating the inauguration of this archive. And I gave a paper on theopoetics, and Catherine Keller was there. She was one of the speakers. And the other guy was a person was this Neil DeRue, who was very young, excellent young phenomenologist, also interested in this. So I gave a paper on theopoetics at that conference, and I liked the way it came out. And I decided to elaborate it more carefully and turn it into a book, which is what this Columbia University Press book, in which I try to explain what I mean and why I think it's called, why I think it is the appropriate or suitable mode for continental phenomenological discourse about theological matters, about God and theology and religion. So that's what's coming.
Thanks, Jack. I'm really looking forward to your work on this. I've read all of your work, Jack, on theopoetics, and I'd actually like to maybe go back to a book that it's a very accessible book, if it's maybe okay to say that, a book 2023, What to Believe, 12 Brief Lessons in Radical Theology, which I think is it's a really great book. And if the first lesson in that, it touches on this idea of radical theology. And in that opening lesson that you say, God does not exist. And this is kind of one of the key parts in a lot of your work, that you make clear that it's not about obviously denying God, but about thinking God otherwise, sort of beyond the idea of God as a being among beings. And that kind of brings us into what you call radical theology. And I'd love to maybe kind of pause or dig into this a little bit, if that was okay, because if I'm to understand it correctly, radical theology means nothing more or nothing less than radical thinking, to the courage to kind of go right down to the roots. The more thinking, the better. If we keep thinking, we will eventually hit radical ground. And it's also one of those words as well that I know when I came across this word when I first kind of fell into theopoetics and all of this wonderful field. This word radical in itself, you encourage us within this not to be stampeded by that word, because it can almost shake the ground, especially in today's world. That word radical can mean many things, and it can cause trouble, it can unsettle, and I'd love to ask you about that. And also a very interesting thing, you say that if you want to meet a radical theologian, there are two places. One is in the unemployment line and the other is on the streets. So marching for social political justice, because radical theology isn't just a theory or a set of ideas. It's about how we are in the world. So it's an open rather than a closed way of what's really going on, as you say, what's really going on. So can we kind of ask you a little bit around that?
Sure, that's what I've been thinking about for the last 10 years or so, and certainly all my life. Yeah, well, what to believe is indeed to be accessible. That's the whole thing. And I had kept rewriting it in order to make it accessible. And whenever I hear any complaints about it, they say, oh, it's still too technical. I say, well, look, this is as best I can do. I mean, this is it. Take it or leave it. The title, by the way, was also not mine. My title was the subtitle, 12 Lessons in Radical Theology. And they said boring, and they wanted something, and they wanted a zinger in the title. So the title is What to Believe, with a question mark, right? Because we're not dogmatizing about what to believe. First of all, the word radical, right? It's an electric word, and it can mean a lot of things. It can be radical right and radical left, and radical thinking, radical doing. The way I'm using it goes all the way back to the book I wrote in the 80s called Radical Hermeneutics. And there the word meant the hermeneutics theory of interpretation. And I was coming into hermeneutics from Heidegger and Gadamer. And then I encountered deconstruction and Jacques Derrida. And I discovered there a more radical way of thinking, where radical meant more interrogatory, more questioning, more probing, exposing the constructedness of the everything. I mean, our culture and the world itself is in terms of its physical processes is a series of formations and genesis of life, genesis of planets and stars. But I wasn't thinking about that then, but about the way the culture is constructed. So everything in the culture has gotten constructed. And if it's gotten constructed, then it's deconstructible. Right? Yeah. Whatever is generated can corrupt, Aristotle says. Whatever is constructed can be deconstructed. And I thought that hermeneutics, as it was being presented, particularly by Gadamer, had a kind of core of undeconstructible truth, which was the deposit in the tradition that was being passed along, so that there would always be this deep truth in the tradition. And hermeneutics was the ever new appropriation of the truth. Okay. All right, which is good. It's very good. If the Catholic Church could swallow that whole, we'd be in good shape. But what I thought deconstruction added to that story is that even what we're calling the truth there, this underlying deposit of truth, that's also can be been constructed. And so a more radical notion of hermeneutics would take into more thorough account the radical constructedness of everything. Theology, physics, whatever you're talking about. Yeah. So when you get to theology, the way I thought, well, if there's a radical hermeneutics, then there certainly is a radical theology. And then my thought just sort of drifted. I was trying to get away from theology. I had sort of started out in it, and pre-Vatican II Catholicism, Pope Pius XII, General Eisenhower was the president, all was well in heaven and on earth. And I had this utterly traditional and firm foundation in basically Council of Trent Catholicism. And when as I studied more and more philosophy and more about the constructability of our beliefs, I just finally at a certain point thought that this is just so much authority and so much unquestionability that I've got to get rid of it. I've just got to break loose from it. And that was what I was doing trying to do in radical hermeneutics. But I think theology was sort of like standing there with its arms crossed, waiting for me to come around the corner and show up again. And which is exactly what happened, because the questions that I had learned in my theological beginnings never went away. And I don't think they should. I mean, I think they are the questions.
Yeah.
I think that the problem with the the problem with traditional religion and institutional religions is the authoritarianism and the supernaturalism of traditional religion. Um, we are all mortals groping about, feeling our way amidst the unknown, right? Let's start with that. Kierkegaard says if you're going to argue with a Hegelian, the first thing you have to do is get the Hegelian to agree that he's a human being, like the rest of us. He's not the absolute spirit. And that's good advice. So what I mean by radical theology is, first of all, that assumption that we are mortals feeling about the in the unknown, in the mystery of that in which we live and move and have our being. And the name of God is a name for that mystery. It's one of the names. There are other names. And so radical theology distinguishes itself from sort of garden variety theology by its suspension of the authority of classical theology, not just Christian theology. This is a worldwide symptom. The authority that classical theology holds, attributes to itself, and the supernaturalism that it lays claim to. I think they are both mystifications and misunderstandings. And then it approaches the scriptures, for example, the scriptures, not with skepticism and secular rationalist disdain. It's not, radical theology is not trying to become one of the cultured despisers of religion, but reading St. Paul say, as a human being who's had some kind of an experience that blew him away and changed his life, and reading him in terms of what he meant by law and what he meant by love and what he meant by love, and reading him, for example, reading him the way without having to sign on to everything they say, reading him the way that Agamben and Badiou and Zizek do. Now, I'm not saying I agree with all those people, but they just read him as another person who has something to say about life and death, joy and sorrow, justice and injustice. And I think the scriptures are like that. And the scriptures have something to say to us. What Jesus has to say about the kingdom of God, you will never hear a philosopher come up with. You will never hear Aristotle say the kinds of things that you find in the parables or in the sayings that we've attributed to Jesus. From the point of view of Aristotle, I think what Jesus is talking about looks crazy. It's upside down. It's the first or last, the last or first. I mean, Aristotle said, look, the people, if you want to lead a good life, find a good person and imitate it. Do what that guy is doing, and he meant a guy. And who is this guy? He's basically good looking, smart, and wise, right? He's well educated, and he's a gentleman. He's noble, and he's smart. You try to be like that guy. In the New Testament, Paul says, you are not well born. You guys are not very smart. And in terms of the world, you are nothings and nobodies. Ta me anta, he says, the nothings and nobodies. And if you listen to Jesus, he says, if you're met with opposition, forgive it. If you meet hatred, return it with love. the last are first. The sinners are privileged. It's an anarchical world. It's a world of it's a radical world of peace and justice and forgiveness and mercy and compassion. It's a radical vision of the world. Right? Now, that doesn't mean it's supernaturally inspired and that the evangelists were sort of sitting there with their ear cocked, listening to an angel and taking dictation. These are people who have been touched by a vision of the world which has been passed down to them, which they eventually, at a certain point, decided they better write it down because he's not coming back the way Paul said he was coming back. Or if he is, it's not anytime soon. And it's a revelation and it's an inspiration, but it's not supernatural. It's a revelation the way a poem is a revelation. It's a inspiration the way a poet is inspired. So it is a theopoetic vision of life which deserves to be taken seriously without supernaturalism on the one side and without rationalist dismissal on the other side. So if you were a Husserlian phenomenologist, you would say you need to suspend your supernatural attitude and suspend your naturalist, reductionist, skeptical attitude. If you do that, then what happens is a phenomenological, theopoetic field opens up, which is the vision that you see there, that you find there in those texts, in whoever this man was, about whom we don't know a really lot. But he left an unmistakable, unforgettable impression on the people around him, which shows up in the form of legends and stories and narratives and striking sayings that
Can I ask you to elaborate a little bit further on a few other vocabularies that you use? You're very good at minting terms, and two books in particular that I'm influenced by, and this is for our listeners who are more academically inclined, would be The Specters of God, which came out a few years ago. And in 2006, I think it was, you came out with The Weakness of God. And The Weakness of God, I thought, was something like a theological turn in your arc, your body of work. You had spoken about theology before, but this was, a careful analysis of the doctrine of God and of creation. Fascinating book. And I still remember, I was a postgrad student at the time. I had that book on my coffee table in my little apartment in St. Louis, Missouri. And I had a colleague or another student come over to say hi. And he saw your book and he was horrified by the title. He said, who would want to write on the weakness of God? And I was defensive immediately. And I said, oh, you misunderstand. This is a really interesting book. He's trying to recuperate and celebrate another way of thinking about Jesus as vulnerable and loving. And I just wonder if you might segue, you've already explained it at some length, but the vocabulary of weakness, and in your 2022 book, Specters of God, you talk a lot about Paul Tillich, and you said that you reject theism along with Tillich because you think that theism, or the traditional belief in God, is mythical and blasphemous. And I like that. I'm wondering if you might tease that out. Is what do you mean by weak God, or the weakness of God? And in what way is that challenging the traditional view of God as an intelligent super being, like an entity or a thing, as blasphemous and mythical?
That's sort of like asking me for my life story here. Your first answer to the person who was shocked by that title is when he said, "Who would ever write like that?" The first answer is St. Paul, right? I'm quoting. I've written two books which are quoting St. Paul's 1 Cor 1, in which he talks about the weakness of God is greater than the wisdom of men, and the foolishness of God is wiser than the wisdom of men. Okay. So, and you're absolutely right. The weakness of God was a turning point. It was a road to Damascus for me. And Catherine Keller did the blurb on the back said in this book, Caputo comes out of the closet as a theologian, and it was this sort of but not a confessional theologian, not a traditional theologian, but a radical theologian. So the weakness of God, first of all, means something has ontological import. That is, I do not think the name of God is the name of a being who does things. I don't think God is the name of God is the name of an agent. It's the name of an agenda. It's the name of something to be done. It's the name of a call which has been captured in a name that wasn't coined in an academic seminar, but was coined in the blood, sweat, and tears of history, the name God. I think what is going on in this name is of the utmost importance, profound importance. But it's not the name of a being who's going to do something or who did something or who's coming to save us. That, I think, is mythological. And it's even blasphemous because he gets into all kinds of trouble because of this attribution, right? Why doesn't he do this? Why doesn't he do that? How come he let Trump get elected? Why doesn't he do something about Christian nationalists? Why doesn't he help us out with climate control? Why doesn't he get all the plastic bags out of the ocean? It's an anthropomorphism, which I think is blasphemous. And it's also an ontological mistake. Tillich's claim was that the name of God is the name not of a being, but of the ground of being. So then it corresponds pretty nicely to Acts 17, when Luke has Paul. He composes a speech for Paul. Almost no chance whatsoever that this actually happened, but Luke composes a speech for Paul on the Areopagus to talk about, in which Paul cites a pagan poet, philosopher Epimenides, to describe that in which we live and move and have our being. So Tillich says that's the way to think about God. God is the deep ground of being. Okay? And religion is having a sensibility. Religion is a sensibility. That's a good way to put it. For the depths of being. So whenever someone is deeply, earnestly in touch with things in moments of quiet meditation or maybe in moments of action, and there's something for which they're willing to put themselves, not others, in harm's way. That's what we mean by religion. That's what we mean by God. Now, I think that is spot on. Now, the only reservation I have about that is it's still a metaphysical claim, right? He's still making a claim about the metaphysics, about being, right? The nature of being. See, the nature of being, ground of being. He's coming out of Schelling, right? He's coming out of German idealism. So he's got a notion of God as ground of being and a notion of ground of being as the metaphysical foundation of reality. Now, that's one step too far. I think that he's right as a phenomenological matter, that he's describing our experience of reality and our engagement with reality and with one another correctly. But he's still got this metaphysics of German idealism behind him. And so I said, well, drop the metaphysics. If you want metaphysics, you've got to learn a lot of physics, and you've got to learn a lot of mathematics, If you want to know what is being itself when we're not around, when we're all dead or never born, then the only language that we have for that is mathematics. So if you want to talk about how the world is without us, being in itself, you need to learn a lot of metaphysics, and you need to do some good experiments, and you need a good telescope. What we do, our job as philosophers and as theologians, and I no longer think there's a serious distinction between those two things once you make that double epoche, once you suspend supernaturalism and suspend rationalism, I don't think there is a distinction between them. Once you do that, then what we're talking about is our ultimate engagement with the world. Now, when you do that, then God is not a super being who created things out of nothing and who's coming to save us and who sent his divine son into the world to take a hit for us. All of that is half of it is mythology, and the other half is St. Anselm. Jesus would have been totally confounded by the things that we say about him. So what do I mean by the weakness of God? First of all, I mean something ontological. I don't think it's the name of a being. Secondly, I mean something, let's say, axiological. That it has to do, the name of God is a way we affirm the sacredness, the holiness, the intrinsic worth, the value, the meaning of our being in the world, which is quite mysterious. The more we learn about the physical universe and the history of evolution, the more mysterious it becomes, and we are more and more and more just this piece of good luck, cosmic good luck here, where the universe has become conscious of itself. So God is not a powerful being. If you want power, God is a call to which we should be the response. Right? God is a question to which we should be the answer. At one point, Schelling says the proper way to think about God is whether God will have been. So, think of it this way. When the scriptures say that wherever two or three are gathered in my name, there I am in the midst of you, or by their fruits you will know them. That's what I think the name of God is. It is a call, a summons for a certain form of life, for a radical form of life. So theopoetics is intrinsically theopraxis, because there is no theos up there who's going to save us, who's coming. St. Paul thought he was going to send Jesus back down again any day now. He was running around the ancient world trying to get everybody on board before Jesus came back. Right? Well, this is Paul's mythological thinking. Right? The name of God is the name of a way to be that, in the case of the New Testament, is figured by the poetic vision of the world, which Jesus calls the kingdom. And so the reality of God, the existence of God, lies in enacting the kingdom, making the kingdom happen. Like Matthew 25, when the servants say, Lord, we didn't know that was you when we were feeding the hungry. We were just feeding the hungry. We didn't know that was you. That's the way it should work. The kingdom of God means feeding the hungry, clothing the naked, visiting the imprisoned. So the weakness of God is relative to our strength, our standing up and assuming responsibility for ourselves. The insistence of God means it's up to us to provide the existence. Right? So it is post-theistic theology. It's even post-pantheistic theology insofar as
I saw that. Yeah. Go ahead, Helena.
Yeah, I'm thinking about what you're saying, and one of the first things I want to say when it's in my head, that book about the 12 lessons in radical theology, the criticism that it wasn't accessible enough. It's very funny. I must say your sense of humor really comes across in this book really, really well. So I just wanted to say that. But I'm thinking about what you're saying around God and the idea that the source of the call that awakens us to thought, to love, to responsibility. You call this, or you describe God in one of your lessons as the unprethinkable, that it's not something that we can pre-think because it thinks us first. It calls us before we call it, if I've got that correct. That idea that that which insists without existing. And I suppose what I'm thinking about in my own mind recently, just last week, I was preaching at a very large scale novena in Ireland here, thousands of people every day. And one of the central aspects of that novena is prayer. And I mean, thousands of petitions of prayer pour in every day. And it's a huge part that almost the life of this kind of the people in the pews, the ordinary believers, this kind of aspect that almost that religion with prayer is so tied up in praying to a God. So I'm kind of wondering about the idea of radical theology and prayer. How can someone pray to the unprethinkable, to the unconditional, to a God who insists? How do we discern that insistence? What does prayer look like? So could you speak a little bit about that, about what happens to prayer as God, as something that calls us, but not something that can be called upon? Maybe that's an oversimplification, but I'm just wondering around that whole area, the ordinary people in the pews on a Sunday, for example.
For the most part, the ordinary people in the pews who are leading, if they are leading decent lives, we should leave them alone. Just don't mess with them. When I learned that lesson from my mother, when at one point I said to her, my mother was just very simple. She wasn't Italian. She was actually English descent. My father was the Italian. But anyway, they were both very pious Catholics. And at one point I mentioned to her, I wasn't even trying to shock her. I just mentioned that the rosary was actually a medieval devotion that had been instituted by the Franciscans in the 13th century. And I think that's I think that's where it came from. Anyway, she was just appalled, just completely rocked by that. And because she thought the rosary was something that the Virgin Mary gave to the Apostle Peter and said, look, I want people to say 5 of these every day. She really thought something like that. And she was so shocked. And I said to myself, okay, that's the last time I inject anything like that with her. She's leading an excellent, wonderful life, a wonderful mother. I'm going to leave her alone. And when my father died, she said to me earnestly, do you think we'll be together again? And I said, oh, yeah. I don't. I think when you're dead, you're dead. But he was not going to disturb that piety. And I don't think we should, unless the hypothetical people in the pew have questions. And if they have questions, then they deserve answers. What I think is going on there is personification. Prayer in the sort of usual sense is personification. Now, personification is not bad, right? It's a trope. It's a literary trope. It's a theopoetic trope. Yorick, Hamlet speaking to the skull of Yorick is personification, and it's some of the most profound words that have ever been uttered. So, or we might speak to the natural world, to a mountain, to a forest, to a tree, to animals. So personification is a deeply significant way of making contact with something of elemental importance, right? But it is personification. So I think a certain amount of prayer is a fair amount of it, and the sort of ordinary usage is personification. For those of us who have been, for whom that spell has been broken, it doesn't dispel it. It dispels the personification, but then it gets you down to what I would call the radical element in prayer, which is this point of contact with what well, being rather than not, life rather than not, justice. These words of elemental importance, these notions, these experiences of elemental importance where we are brought up short and make a kind of meditative contact with that in which we live and move and have our being. So I think that prayer is deeply, deeply important. And it has no necessary relationship to what we call God. That's a form of it. It's a way to make contact with matters of ultimate concern. One of the books of Derrida's that I think is the most valuable, that I treasure the most, is the book that he wrote called Circumfessions, where he reenacts, I think that's the way to put it, reenacts Augustine's Confessions. He doesn't come at Augustine's Confessions like a skeptical critic, and he doesn't try to criticize his dualism or his authoritarianism or his literalism or anything else about him. What he does, and there are actually biographical reasons for this because they're both Algerians. They're both ancient Numidia, modern Algeria. He grew up on a street called the Rue Saint-Augustin. He takes the Confessions to be the act of Augustine's Confessions to be a deeply important mode of relating to the world, and he puts himself in. He kneels down beside Augustine, and he begins praying with him, even though he doesn't believe in God. He's not a theist. He's not a believer. Now, I had the good fortune to get to know him. And I've asked him. I asked him in person, and I asked him professionally. And I said, "Who are you praying to?" And he said, his wonderful sense of humor. He says, "Oh, if I knew that, I would know everything. If I knew that, I would know everything." He's praying to. He says, "I have been asking myself Saint Augustine's question." What do I love when I love my God? All my life. Not because he believes in God, not because he's an Augustinian, not because he's Catholic, but because the name of God is for him, it's the name of the undeconstructible. The dream, the hope, the prayer for the justice to come, the democracy to come, the kingdom to come. And that was the book that was behind my Prayers and Tears of Jacques Derrida and eventually The Weakness of God. Because I think that what Derrida calls the undeconstructible, he says at one point, deconstruction cannot proceed without love. That is, our attempt to radicalize something is not an attempt to burn it down or blow it up. It's an attempt to get at what is really going on there in that, whatever it is, that institution, that scientific work, that piece of literature, whatever it is, which he calls the event. So the coming of what we can't see coming, the hope against hope in the unforeseeable. And that radical unforeseeability of the future, my own personal future, the future of the world at the moment, goes hand in hand with this other thing called the unprethinkable. That things are rather than not. Aristotle says thinking should never be stronger than being. Being is being brings forth thought, and we are this extraordinary moment, this Augenblick. The way Kierkegaard and Heidegger use that word. This Augenblick in which the universe takes note of itself, and So we stand here in this moment in between an unprethinkable beginning, time out of mind, and an unforeseeable future. This is a mystery, that in which we live and move and have our being. And it's the mystery that provokes philosophy, theology, poetry, science, political action, everything. It's the element in which we live and move and have our being.
Could I follow that up with one more question related to that? It seems like you're saying the indestructible or the indeconstructible, the one thing that we cannot escape from, or that we cannot drill further down to or from, is our mortality and our finitude, just being time-bound, ordinary creatures. And I only read books that I find nourishing and therapeutic. And I'm wondering if there's a kind of therapy here in your work. There's some kind of therapeutic value that you're helping us realize we're not angels, we're not little gods, we're just ordinary humans, and that merits celebration. That's sufficient. We don't need to practice some kind of, this is for my little brother Alex. I know he'll be listening, but you've written a little bit, Jack, on Gnosticism and soft Gnosticism. And for our listeners, that just means a kind of otherworldly attitude that devalues the world we're in right here and now. And it's a kind of dualism that can infect Christian theology in particular, but any theologies that are overly supernatural or overly rigid and literal about the natural and the supernatural. And I'm wondering if that's part of the underlying motive of your work, that you find real therapeutic value in affirming where we are here.
Absolutely, yes, indeed. It's a kind of I don't know, existential phenomenological therapy. It's not it's professional therapy, but it's the healing power of recognizing mortality and embracing it not as a curse or a limit, but as the condition of why things and how things are so precious to us. My image is the image of, when I'm talking like this, is the image of lovers clinging to each other in the night because they know in the morning they must part. Well, life is like that. And that way of thinking about it, approaching it, makes every moment all the more precious. And then when you look at it on a cosmic scale and you see what a piece of luck the Earth is, geologically, cosmologically, it's finitude, right? Because it's cosmically speaking, the universe is running out of energy. There's no such thing as renewable energy in the universe. It's increasing entropy, and the sun's burning out, and the Earth will be gone. It'll all be gone. And that makes this piece of luck called the Earth all the more precious. So yeah, it's God. It certainly has a therapeutic value, and that's the radical part. You're not radical doesn't mean radical foundation. It means radical exposure, radical. It's like Kierkegaard, and it's concluding on Scientific Postscript. That thing you want is climb because he's sitting in the park, he's smoking a cigar, he's looking at all these happy people around him, and he's thinking that everybody's making everything easier. The Hegelians are making theology easier. The Industrial Revolution is making life easier. We've got omnibuses and steamships and telegraphs, and so he says the sole thing that remains to me is to make things more difficult. And so he means the one danger is thinking there is no danger. The one difficulty is when you don't realize there's difficulty. So facing up to the difficulty, the mortality, the limits of our existence is healing.
Yeah.
Yeah, and your question raises another question, and that is, we are, they say, some say, on the brink of surpassing that mortal, finite human condition. And we're in the middle of a phenomenon called transhumanism and posthumanism, which is something that really interests me now. If I were a PhD student right now, that's what I would be writing my dissertation on, the question of posthumanism. What's going on there?
I would call transhumanism Gnostic right away. I know that word is thrown around a lot, but I'm really interested by Manichaeanism and Gnosticism. And what motivates those ancient traditions is a fear of contingency. So they want to escape contingency and uncertainty, and they want to shift into some kind of, I suppose, the opposite of that certainty, something eternal, something pure. And I think that's what transhumanism reminds me of a little bit, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. No, you're right. You're right. And also, of course, Cartesianism. It's thinking of us in terms of a consciousness and cogito.
Yeah, exactly.
The other thing is that I found interesting is it reminds me of medieval angelology. I was so Catholic when I was young that I wrote my master's thesis on Thomas Aquinas' angelology. What they're saying about about AI and about uploading consciousness is very similar to what Aquinas imagined when he imagined what it would be like to be a disembodied intelligence. Kafka imagined what it would be like to be a cockroach, and Thomas Aquinas could imagine what it would be like to have an intelligence which does not depend upon the senses, that would be free of corporeal limitations.
That might be a topic for the next book, something on angelology. That would be fascinating.
Well, the last chapter of Spectres of God. See, that was you asked. Helena asked me about the Spectres of God. That was part of the figure of speech in the Spectres of God. The final spectrology is upon us right now with this notion of uploading. But even then, I mean, one thing that I thought of there is that even then, even if, I mean, what started a lot of this was trying to equip human beings. Cyborgs were the U.S. Air Force trying to equip human beings for space travel and for long distance space travel, because you're dealing with, when you start talking about light years, that's pretty far. So they were talking about equipping human beings that were to undertake journeys that would last 100 years. And if we don't blow ourselves off the face of the earth, or if we don't poison the atmosphere and kill ourselves off, what is it going to be like in 50 years, in 100 years? It's going to be unimaginable, right? And we will become galactic characters, we're players. Even then, the more we learn, the more unencompassable it is. So I think this structural relationship of mortality or finitude is structural. It's structural. It can't be superseded. So even with our most wild expectations for AI and for uploading consciousness, we will still be faced with our limits. I mean, the Earth itself, the stars, they're burning out. Right? This man, I'm having trouble. I'll think about it when this thing's over. He says, the longer John Wheeler, the longer the island of knowledge grows, the greater the island of knowledge grows, the longer the shoreline of ignorance is. And I think that's a structural matter. So I think we will always be dealing with the mystery, what Heidegger called openness to the mystery. I think that's a structural feature, no matter how successful the transhuman and posthuman project is. That the mystery will be different, but it will retain this same structural relationship of unencompassability.
If it's structural, and I totally agree with that. We do die, we age, we're mortal. You write in Spectres of God that even death is good. Why not reconcile ourselves with it? Why not just be at home in contingency and death and finitude? Why try to escape it? Why be anxious about it? And why not just lean into it? And I feel like there are resources in certain philosophers, even theologians throughout the ages, that talk about how important it is to be embodied. I just feel like therapeutically, people would be so much happier and content if they just saw everything that they were and just leaned into it and lived within it, inhabited the world they already have, and saw it as a gift rather as something to flee from or escape. We're coming towards the end of the time, Jack. I thought I'd read one brief quote. We traditionally do that from a book from one of from our speakers. And this is from page 263, Spectres of God. And I think it's a lovely summary statement on your work there. And you say, and I quote, "A theopoetics of the unconditional call that goes under the name of God. It's a call that calls. It gets itself called in the middle voice, without guarantees, without a super being coming on a cloud or the ground of being emerging from below to hold it up. What gets itself called? It feeds the hungry. It comes without the least assurance that we will later on enjoy a heavenly banquet. The call calls without promises, without threats. The call calls without assurances that there's anything in it for us, without why or warranty, without being or sovereign power, without conditions, unconditionally, period. Enough said." Close quote. And I think for me, that's very therapeutic. I think that might be disturbing, but sometimes good education is disturbing. But you're asking us there to stop worrying about this other world, stop speculating about something outside of time and space, and just inhabit where we are. And I just think that's a really lovely, that quote really stuck with me. And I wonder, in closing, if you might, this is just for our listeners out there, if you have a vast body of work. You're obviously very disciplined, and you produce books, lots of them, and they're all really good. Would you recommend one in particular for someone to get to get a handle on your work, like an entry point into your work? Is there one or two books that you find would be accessible entry points?
Yeah, I started doing that actually at the invitation of Routledge back in 2001. I read a book called On Religion. The first edition of On Religion, I put a second edition out that was not as successful because I complicated it. And I should have left it alone. But the first edition of On Religion was very, very successful introduction, without jargon, without a lot of technical language, to what we're calling radical theology or theopoetics right now. So that's a good one. If you're particularly interested in the Christian tradition, On Religion was a more general meditation on the nature of God and religion. But if you're particularly interested in the Christian tradition, then What Would Jesus Deconstruct has done very well, and is particularly valuable now, I think, in the light of Christian nationalism. Um, I think that we need to be able to respond to people who have confused, literally, they're not making this up, confused Jesus with John Wayne. There's a book by a woman at Calvin College called Jesus and John Wayne, and I thought she was just being cute. She wasn't kidding. She wasn't kidding. So what we deconstruct is, I think, is good for that. It's particularly useful for dealing with the Christian nationalist threat that we're experiencing now. And then, if what you're interested in is what we've been calling radical theology, then the What to Believe book that Helena mentioned at the beginning, I think that's probably the most accessible for that kind of question. So the other one right now, if you live in Trump world, is I read a book called Hoping Against Hope. So that's sort of where I am right now. Every morning I get up and read a passage from that book so I can keep going. But
Lovely.
anyway, so I've enjoyed doing that. I never tried to do it before I was 60 years old, writing for a more general public, because I had this academic prejudice that I would ruin my reputation if I started writing things that people could understand. Our job is to read unreadable papers to one another, and the more unreadable, the better. But Routledge invited me to do this thing, which resulted in religion, and I found that I enjoyed it, and that it really did get. I started getting correspondence from people who said that people thinking about this stuff, but they don't have the vocabulary, and they're intimidated by the jargon. So it really does serve a purpose to write like that. It's what we do as teachers anyway, right? You're introducing students for whom this is a whole new world, and so you've got to be able to speak, if I may say so, American English to them. You need to be able to speak plain English to them, and it's also very helpful to us to say, well, what we're talking about actually makes sense, and you can explain it. It's not the jargon is just shorthand, but when you can't use the shorthand, you just have to tell people what you're talking about. So this is a very useful exercise from time to time.
Yeah, and you're very good at it. So What Would Jesus Deconstruct is one book. On Religion is another book. And then What to Believe, ? Is a more recent book. And they're all very accessible. I actually reviewed back in the day what would Jesus deconstruct. I remember thinking what a interesting, engaging introduction to your thinking. And again, I was a graduate student at the time, and there was a kind of a turn then as well, 2007, 8, and 9, where academics were starting to write popular books, and that's a really excellent idea. Well, look, we're really humbled and grateful for you taking more than an hour to speak with us, and we just want to thank you again, myself and Helena, and perhaps we can talk again in the future after your book comes out. And thank you again.
I'd be delighted, and I thank you for the invitation, and keep up the good work. This is what you're doing is really valuable work, I think, and as a way of getting the word out there. So good luck with your own work.
Thank you.
Thank you.